To ask people to choose God as an explanation over science is, in technical terms, a category mistake in philosophy.
Hi there, my name's Tom Cousins and this is Professor John Lennox, and welcome to the best of Professor John Lennox, a top hits album of John's most impactful messages from decades of teaching, debating and writing on the most pressing issues of our time. This episode we're looking at Can Science Explain Everything? John, would you mind introing yourself, please?
Not at all. I'm a retired professor of mathematics at Oxford University and have been involved all my life in speaking, writing, thinking about the big questions. And one of the things as a scientist one comes up against is this whole business of what are the limits, if any, of science? Can it indeed explain everything?
So John, you wrote a book that literally has this name, Can Science Explain Everything? Why are you so interested in this particular subject?
Well, for a simple reason that the idea that science can explain everything is very dominant, particularly in the West and particularly in the university and the academy. And we call it scientism. And it basically is saying science is the only way to truth. Now, I happen to like logic as a mathematician. And I remember first thinking about this and feeling there's something odd about that very statement. Science is the only way to truth, because it's not a statement of science. And if science is the only way to truth, then if this is true, it's false at the same time, which means that it's logically incoherent. So it's very important to ask the question, just what is its reach? It clearly is logically incoherent to say it tells us everything, but there must be more reason than that to reject that claim. Does science have any limits? Now, there's a very famous Oxford Nobel Prize winner called Sir Peter Medawar, and he wrote a marvellous book about advice for a young scientist. And in it, he says it's very easy to see that science has its limits. And I'm speaking of the natural sciences now. In that, it cannot, quote, even answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? And what is the meaning of life? Then he added, if we want to answer those questions, we have to look beyond the natural sciences to literature, philosophy, and I would add theology and a lot of other things. Now, sitting behind that is a very important point, that people who say that science can explain everything are being rather foolish, actually, because if it was true, half the faculties in most universities would have to close tomorrow. Because history, economics, languages, literature, music, all the arts, they're not natural science. So if science tells us everything, there's absolutely no need for them. Now, that is a very silly view. And therefore, we need to stand back from this and take Medawar's point really seriously. The natural sciences are powerful and successful because they can't explain everything. They have a narrow grid of questions they ask and are very successful at solving. You see, we must never be led or be deceived into thinking that science and rationality are coextensive. Rationality, the things that are reasonable and rational, is a far bigger field than the natural sciences. And yet this idea, science can explain everything, it's the only way to truth, is cutting that off completely. So that's the first point. Also, I'd written a number of books and articles about the relationship of science to theology, if you want to put it in subject terms. In other words, the God debate, God and science. And some people found them a little bit inaccessible. And I was encouraged to try to write in a way that a thinking young person at school or at university could really access it and get something from it. And this book is the result of that. It's not only dealing with science, but it's dealing with science as to where it really fits since it's limited. What amount of the big picture does it give us, and what other rational disciplines are needed to explore reality?
I think it might be helpful to understand, as we explore this question, Gould's vision of non-overlapping magisteria. So the way I'm hearing you express it is that science has a very specific grid of competence, and then outside of that grid, other subject areas exist. I think what we're seeing progressively, in fact, is that science is able to start engaging with some of the theological questions, or the questions we might leave for theology to answer. For example, the evolution debate, the psychological study of theology. What do you think about there being a partial overlap between science and, say, philosophy, or science and theology? Or do you believe they're completely separate entities?
Well, the late Stephen Jay Gould, who's always worth reading, put up this idea of non-overlapping magisteria. A magisterium is just a body of teaching. And so he said, look, everything will go well if you keep science and God, or science and theology, separated. Well, you're hinting at what I believe to be the truth, in that you can't quite do that. Because let's take the simplest example of all. The very first sentence in the Bible, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that's talking about the very same heavens and earth that scientists study. And there is enough overlap to be important, although it's very essential to say at the beginning that in no way is anyone taking the Bible as a textbook of science. We don't teach algebra from Leviticus or quantum mechanics from Isaiah. Of course not. But there are certain parts, particularly those dealing with origins, in the beginning God created, where there is real overlap in the disciplines, and we need to take that seriously. Because the other defect of the non-overlapping magisteria idea was, but it wasn't so much stated, was science tells us the truth and gives us reality, whereas everything else is fairy tales and myths and Santa Claus and all this kind of thing, which is sheer nonsense, of course, because history and psychology and all of these things are dealing with realities of different levels.
John, this issue has been the subject of many of your debates over the decades. How have eminent atheists and agnostics addressed this question, can science explain everything, over the years?
Way in the ancient world, you had a tension between two worldviews. Roughly speaking, the theistic and the atheistic worldviews. And that tension is seen, for example, you have Socrates and Plato on one side, and then you have Leucippus and the early atomists on the other side. And Democritus and Leucippus, developed the brilliant idea of everything being composed of atoms. And there were only two things in existence, atoms and empty space, the void. And the atoms tumbling through empty space eventually coalesce to form galaxies and stars in the universe as we know it. And there's no God behind it at all. There's no intelligent input. It simply happens by what we now call as a kind of cosmic evolutionary process. Unguided, no goal. It just happened as a basic brute fact. Over against that, there's the theistic view that there is a God who created it, is external to it in some sense, and who is bringing it to a goal. And that tension has barreled up through the centuries with all kinds of different manifestations. In the Enlightenment, for example, where you got a huge tension between a pretty immoral face of a renegade professing Christian church, say in France, and the philosophe who said the problem here is God, let's get rid of God. That carries over into England. Now I'm being very simplistic here, but it's basically that. So you had then the famous debate in Oxford, in the Natural History Museum, between Huxley and Wilberforce, Bishop Wilberforce. And Huxley was on a crusade to get rid of amateur clerical scientists. He wanted churches to be turned into temples of Sophia, the goddess of wisdom, and wanted to get rid of these people. Now, when you analyze that, the iconical way of taking it is the wrong way, and that is, this is a war between science and religion. It isn't. It actually was very much a social thing and also driven by an atheistic worldview. And people like Wilberforce got it in the neck because they were amateur scientists, but they were clerics as well. And of course, then the caricatures came running, and that debate in Oxford is often characterized by the brilliant atheist scientist Huxley slays the ignorant Bishop Wilberforce who uses arguments from the Bible. Well, I have read the whole debate in detail, and Wilberforce did no such thing. In fact, he said right at the beginning, I will not use arguments, biblical arguments or arguments from theology. I base it in science. And when Darwin read what he'd said, he remarked that he is uncommonly exposed to all the difficulties in my theory. Actually, Wilberforce was a brilliant naturalist. So that this gets all distorted, and unfortunately the distortion remains. So very often people say to me, of course I can't believe in God as a scientist. That was settled long ago between Huxley and Wilberforce. So there's that difficulty. Then compounded on that is the much more recent problem, illustrated by Dawkins, Richard Dawkins, and the late Stephen Hawking, where they present us with this idea that you have to choose between science and God. You see, Stephen Jay Gould, we referred to earlier, non-overlapping magisteria. There are two bodies of teaching, and there are serious people on both sides, and we can have both. Just don't mix them. But now, the next step is to say, look, you've got to choose between the two. Now, I at first couldn't understand that. Why choose between science and God? And what I came to in the end as a moment of, I'd call it almost enlightenment, was to see what the problem was. And the problem was twofold. There was a confusion, believe it or not, about the nature of science and a confusion about the nature of God. Now, here are these atheists saying you must choose between science and God, because as Dawkins says in his book, The God Delusion, God is put forward as the same kind of explanation as science is putting forward, and is in the end a God of the gaps. Putting that very crudely, it says, oh, look at this phenomenon in nature, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Now, just a moment, because that represents a sheer misunderstanding of the nature of God. That's talking about Greek gods. And this is hugely important, because the ancient Greeks, things they didn't understand or feared, like thunder and lightning, they postulated a God behind them. Come to Oxford University, do the first lecture in atmospheric physics, and those gods disappear. And this is what both Dawkins and Hawking and many others think that I as a Christian believe. My God is a placeholder covering ignorance, and science will soon explain everything and get rid of God. Well, I would concede gladly that science has got rid of a lot of false gods. But you see, what they think is totally wrong is the nature of the God of the Bible. I sometimes amuse myself by saying to people, have you ever read the first sentence in the Bible? In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe that we don't yet understand. And of course people laugh. It doesn't say that. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is everything. The bits we understand, the bits we don't. Now here's the interesting thing. It's the bits we do understand that I believe point to the existence of God. Newton demonstrated that in the most brilliant book in the whole history of science, the Principia Mathematica. And he had his law of gravitation, a lot of other stuff as well. And when he discovered that, he didn't say, wonderful, I don't need God now. I've got a mathematical law. No, he actually said, I hope that this book brings thinking people to see that there's a deity. Because, of course, he was saying, look what a genius God is, who did it this way. And I often say to people, look, who understands a Rembrandt painting better? An ignoramus like me or somebody who studied painting? The person who studied painting can see much more in the genius of the Rembrandt who did it that way than I can. It's exactly the same. So that's the first major point I would make. The God of the Bible is not a Greek God. There was a brilliant academic, again in Oxford, called Werner Jaeger, and he wrote a book on the Greek gods, and he said this, which I found very important. The huge difference between the Greek gods and the God of the Bible is that the Greek gods were descended from the universe. In other words, they were products of the primeval soup or chaos. Whereas, he said, the God of the Bible created the universe. That's a profound difference. That's point number one in there. The second point is easier. It's simply to say that to ask people to choose God as an explanation over science is, in technical terms, a category mistake in philosophy. It's confusing two sorts of explanation. I can illustrate that very easily. Let's imagine we're looking at a kettle and it's boiling. Why is the water boiling? Well, because the heat energy is being transferred from the gas flame through the kettle, agitating the molecules of water, and it's boiling. Well, we could say that, or we could say it's boiling because I'd love a cup of tea right now. I expect you would too. Now, think of those two explanations. They do not conflict. They do not even compete. They complement. But they're completely different in category. One is a scientific explanation in terms of heat physics. The other is an agent explanation in terms of my desire, your desire for a cup of tea. Now, let's ratchet that up to the size of the universe. And let me put it this way. God no more competes with science as an explanation for the universe than Henry Ford competes with automobile engineering or physics as an explanation for the motor car. And when I put that to kids as young as 10 and ask them, please choose between Henry Ford and automobile engineering. But sir, you need both. All the hands go up. I wish some professors could see that, because it really is a serious mistake to confuse the categories here. That the God explanation is an overarching meta-narrative into which science fits. It doesn't compete. So one of my main arguments here is to say we need to be very careful about understanding the nature of explanation.
So, as I understand your explanation, science answers the how category of questions. Religion might answer the why category of questions. But I would argue from our earlier conversation about partial overlap, there are some areas that you would say both categories overlap. And actually, I think you would make some arguments from science that God, in fact, exists.
Oh, sure. But let's take the how and why first. You're substantially right. But there are two kinds of why, just to make it a little bit more difficult. There's the why of purpose. Science cannot answer that. But there's the why of function. Why is this bit there? And you can often have a scientific explanation, particularly in biology and physics and so on. Why is something there? That's the why of function. And that really belongs to the how side. So that's absolutely right. But the next thing is there evidence within science itself that is the results of science that would point towards God? If I step back from your question, Tom, for a moment, it seems to me there are three areas connected with science that point to the existence of God. One's the history of science. The next is the nature and philosophy of science, like I've just explained, the nature of explanation. And the third that you've just asked about is the results of science. I think it's worth saying something about the history, if you don't mind, at the beginning, because it's the easiest thing of all. And that's the fact that the early pioneers of modern science, virtually without exception, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, Faraday, and a whole lot of others, were all believers in God. And historians and philosophers have looked at that, and they've come up with the thesis, with nuances of course, but by and large they agree that there's an intimate connection between the biblical worldview and the rise of modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries, which was beautifully explained by C.S. Lewis. Lewis wrote this: men became scientific because they expected law in nature. and the expected law of nature because they believed in a legislator, a lawgiver. So I often put it this way to provoke people into thinking, I'm not remotely ashamed of being a Christian, a believer in God, and a scientist, because arguably the Bible gave me my subject. So there's a very close link, and you can't argue that away. It simply is a fact. So that's the history of science. We've said a little bit about the philosophy of science, but you've asked me about pointers within science. Now, this is fascinating, and it might surprise some people what my first answer to your question is. The thing that points most towards the existence of God, where science is concerned, is the fact that we can do science. First of all, we've got this incredible fact that the universe, at least in part, is mathematically describable. And that is an axiom for all scientists. That's what prompted Einstein to say, the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And then he went on to add, I cannot imagine a genuine scientist without that faith. That is the belief that the universe is mathematically intelligible. You've got to believe that before you start any science. But why would you believe it? You see, here the atheist view stumbles and falls. And I'm now going to say something else very provocative. I see the problem not between science and God, but between science and atheism. First of all, it's obvious that there's no necessary conflict between science and God. Nobel Prize for Physics. Let me name two winners of it. Peter Higgs, brilliant atheist. William Phillips, brilliant Christian American physicist. What divides them? Not their science. What divides them is their worldview. It's not a science versus God debate at all. It's actually a debate between two worldviews, atheism and theism, and there are brilliant scientists on both sides of it. And if we don't realize that, we're going to focus on the wrong thing. So it's not a debate between science and God. But if you make it such, you see, come down to this fundamental faith of all scientists, and that raises a huge question that I'm often accused of. Look, a scientist is rational, they don't need faith. That's absolute nonsense. Faith is essential to every possible human activity, and particularly science. Einstein can't imagine a scientist without that faith. But why should a scientist believe that the universe is in part accessible to the human mind? I have lots of fun with many scientists, leading scientists. I say to them, what do you do science with? And they name some very expensive machine, but then I point to my head. They say, your brain. I actually believe there's a difference between the mind and the brain, but let it stand. You do science with your brain, do you? Yes. Well, tell me about the brain. Give me a brief history of the brain. Well, I mean, we all know that the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided natural process. And I look at them and I say, and do you trust it? Be honest with me now. If you knew that the computer you use every day in your lab was the end product of an unguided, mindless process, would you trust it? And I forced the answer in every instance, and it's been no, I would not. And then I just smile and say, you got a problem, haven't you? You're trusting your brain or your mind to do science when your explanation for it is reductionist. It's in terms of physics and chemistry and atoms and all this kind of thing. But you're shooting yourself not in the foot, which is painful, but in the brain, which is fatal. In other words, I want to argue that science and atheism are very bad bedfellows here.
I suppose to come back on that briefly, the argument would be we understand to the extent that we can with a mind that has emerged as opposed to been created. And in that worldview, both the theist and the atheist don't have any distinguishing attributes other than their beliefs about the world, because the mind is simply a product of these processes, and it still does give us a degree of understanding. And I think actually many of the, say, new atheist authors nearing the end of their reign started to admit very clearly that they were not even sure that we had free will.
Well, several questions in there, but the real problem with what you've said is the word emerge, and simply if you want to be a scientist, you must give an account of that. And that's what's failing massively. Start with the very origin of life itself. There are no scientific accounts that cut the ice. Jim Tour in Rice University, holding 3 chairs simultaneously with a publication rate that's spectacular, 750 publications and all sorts of stuff. A genius and an expert in the origin of life as a chemist. Now, as a chemist, he issued a challenge, giving people, because he gets a lot of criticism for his views, he thinks the origin of life cannot be explained scientifically. So he issued a challenge and says, I'll wait 60 days. And if I have a challenge on one of 5 major questions of the origin of life, I will remove from the internet every single thing I've ever said. The 60 days are up. And no one responded. In other words, all this claim that has simply emerged is hot air until scientists pinpoint it. That's not the only difficulty, of course. Finally, to your question on the results of science, there's one very important result in physics and astronomy, and that's the fine-tuning of the universe. And just to give you a little anecdote, I once, in one of my debates, I was up against a very pleasant, delightful, brilliant philosopher here, Professor Peter Millikan, and he invited me to speak to his students, and he promised me they'd tear me to pieces because they were all atheists. And he said, I hope you're going to use the best argument against atheism that I know. Well, I said, Peter, if you tell me, I'll use it. Well, he said, if ever I was to become a Christian, it would be at least partly on the basis of the fine-tuning of the constants, the physical constant of the universe, because he said that is a fact. We all see it. But the attempts are made to explain it. Hawking says we got to do something. And of course, you get various attempts. But I still believe, with my former teacher of quantum mechanics, the late Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, that the explanation in terms of a God who designed the world is very much better than the explanation in terms of a multiverse, an ensemble of an infinite number of universes that are totally inaccessible to us. I find impossible to believe in that view. It doesn't prove, of course, the existence of God, and that's important. You only get proof in pure mathematics, which is my field, but you can get evidence. I can't prove mathematically or scientifically that my wife loves me, but I'd stake my life on it because there's evidence for it.
Just to summarise, so you're saying there, for you, some of the overlaps that are in favour of the Christian message are, firstly, the history of science, secondly, that the universe is intelligible,
yes,
and thirdly, that the universe is finely tuned.
Yes.
And the best explanation out of the bag is that God tuned it that way, created it that way.
Yes, and I'd prefer an explanation that makes sense to one that doesn't, to put it very bluntly.
I think this statement, can science explain everything, has huge implications on morality or understanding of morality. Could you tell us a bit about how you believe our understanding of the answer to that question, can science explain everything, should govern our ethical decision making?
Well, the interesting thing about that question is that that's precisely the one thing that science cannot explain, is ethical and moral norms. Einstein again said, you can talk about the ethical foundations of science, you cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. That this is one of the things that lies outside the reach of the natural sciences. Einstein realized it, so did the famous American physics Nobel Prize winner, Richard Feynman. He said the laws of nature don't come with a moral norm attached to them, by which I think he meant that if you give your aunt strychnine, it'll give her an uncomfortable day, it'll probably kill her. But the laws of nature, that fact won't tell you whether it's right for you to do so, to get your hands on her property. You know, the ethics are not within the laws of science. Now, I know there have been recent attempts to bring them in, notably by Sam Harris, but it's a sleight of hand. If you investigate it, as many philosophers have done, you'll find he smuggles the ethics in front-loaded, so he's not explaining ethics through science. Where science can help us with ethical decisions, though, that is an important side angle on this. Science can tell us what this stuff can do, but it won't tell us whether we should implement it in various directions, the ethics has to come from somewhere else. Now, this is a huge topic in philosophy, in moral philosophy, and I'm going to cut it very short. A fully deterministic universe has no moral content whatsoever. And it's interesting to me, it has been for many years, that Richard Dawkins essentially conceded that totally. He says, and I'm quoting it roughly, "This world is exactly what you'd expect to find if at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice. DNA just is, and we dance to its music." So that's a logical consequence of his atheism, to banish ethics completely. But you see, we know that we're moral beings. We know there's good and evil. And as the philosopher John Mackey of Oxford, who was an atheist, said, if you admit that there are absolute moral standards, you've got a very short route to the existence of God. And I simply say, okay, good then. Let's test that. Have you ever met any sane person that believes that torturing babies is good? No. So there are absolutes. And we all believe in them, of course. There are many absolutes. So it seems to me, therefore, that if you start believing, can science explain everything, you're going to end up atheistic, and you're going to end up emptying the universe of the moral meaning you desperately need and want. So it's another version of shooting yourself and destroying humanity. And I'll never forget, just to end this with an anecdote, meeting a very eminent mathematician in the Russian Academy of Sciences, and he said, "John, do you know, we thought we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings, and far too late we found we couldn't."
I want to loop us back to the original question, can science explain everything? And I want to take us more into the philosophical space. John, can you explain to us a little bit about Aunt Matilda, please?
The little analogy about Aunt Matilda is designed to explain in simple terms that science is limited. Science is powerful, yet it's limited. The idea is simply this: suppose my Aunt Matilda, a fictitious aunt of course, has made a cake, and she brings it into a room full of Nobel Prize winners. And she says, "Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to analyze this cake from the perspective of your individual disciplines." So the biochemists look at its nutritional value and all this kind of thing. The chemists look at the elements and compounds out of which it's composed. And the physicists essentially dissolve it into atoms, molecules, quarks, leptons, everything else. And we now imagine that they've each given a full description of the cake in terms of their own individual disciplines. And then she smiles at them and she says, "Just before you go, now tell me why I made it. Now you physicists, tell me." The physicist has got to say, "Sorry, I can't." And the chemist the same. You can't tell it from chemistry, you can't tell it from biochemistry or biology. In fact, you'll never know unless she reveals it to you. Now here's the interesting thing. It's a very simple analogy. When she reveals it, how's she going to do that? Usually by speaking. Now that would shut off your reason when she reveals it, because you use your reason on what she says to see if it makes sense. And if she says, "I made it for the man in the moon," you may begin to suspect her sanity. But if she says she made it for her nephew John Lennox over there, you might be inclined to believe her. Now let's ratchet that up to the size of the universe. You can analyze it scientifically. But chemists, physicists, biologists will not be able to say why it was made, or indeed if there's any purpose behind it. The only way we'll get to that is if there is a maker, and if that maker reveals it to us. Now the claim, the biblical claim, is that there is a creator and he has revealed it to us. He has spoken in words and we can use our reason on them. I use that illustration to explain the difference between reason and revelation. Stand back from the whole thing. I believe there are at least two ways of understanding the world around us. The first is by looking at nature. the sciences. The other way is by having things revealed to us that the sciences cannot reveal. The late Lord Jonathan Sacks, the chief rabbi of the UK, put it beautifully. He said, science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts them together to see what they mean. The father of modern science, Bacon, used to say God has written two books, the book of nature, the book of his word. And a wise person would be seen to be studying both of them. The book of nature and the book of God's word both require reason to understand them. That's very important. Not just nature and science requires reason. Studying the Bible requires reason. But there are things in Scripture revealed by God that naked reason cannot reach. So it's helpful because everybody can see that it's right, that you have to have Aunt Matilda revealing it. So the big question comes, is it true on the higher level what's obvious on the lower level? Is there someone who stands in the same relationship to the universe as Aunt Matilda stands to her cake and who has spoken and revealed it to us? And I'm convinced that there is.
John, thank you so much. It's been such a wonder hearing from you, and thank you also for listening. This has been the best of Professor John Lennox. Bye.